waged a war against the civilian population of that country and was responsible for the murder of thousands of individuals over that course of time, because he knew to a degree of certainty that if he ever gave in, if he ever stopped fighting, if he ever stopped and lost control of that country and his situation, the international community would hold him accountable for those crimes. We think that when you do that, and you take that policy and you apply it to the sorts of sclerotic and corrupt, violent elites that currently exist and hold power and are likely to commit the sorts of crimes that would warrant ICC indictment, you condemn the country that they're in charge of to be held hostage, you delay change and reform, and you do not seek the sorts of justice that we'd like to achieve. So we're going to do two things. Firstly, we're never going to prosecute international leaders when they're sitting. And secondly, we're happy for the international community to use targeted immunity on a case-by-case basis as a bargaining chip to ensure that those sorts of leaders are willing and able to step down after the fact without seeing that prosecution and entrenching it over time. So three things from me in this speech. Firstly, why we value prospective justice for the people of these countries rather than immediate judicial justice. Secondly, the importance of sitting head of state immunity to the international arena. And third, why this makes the job of the ICC in international law incredibly difficult. So firstly, we think that the biggest concern of the international community and international institutions should be to secure the rights to self-determination of people within their country and secure their well-being for all. And we'd say that the most important things to those people, like the most important thing to the people of Sudan, is that Omar al-Bashir stops violently funding a war in that country. The most important thing to the people of Libya is that Gaddafi relinquishes power and enables their self-determination and the people that they want. And thirdly, the people of Zimbabwe, they have a leader and a smooth transition to NDC rule and unity government that actually is concerned with their interests. What this policy does, of being able to indict sitting leaders, is it gives the leaders in charge a degree of certainty that when they lose power and when they lose control, they will face the wrath of the international community immediately. The obvious incentive from that is that they will do whatever it takes to cling on to that power for as long as they can. They will become more oppressive. They will become suspicious of any architecture of Western intervention, be it companies, NGOs, or neutral observers. They will erect hard barriers to incremental change. They will not want to engage in the sorts of unity governments that we've seen in Zimbabwe and those sorts of moderating reform that allows change in those countries. We think that at best, that just delays the change that we would like to see and that those people would like to see that is most important for them and much more important for them than any vague notion of a prosecution that may or may not restore, may or may not do anything to alleviate the pain they feel from the crimes that they've been the victims of. But at worst, it means that we condemn future victims and a big proportion of those populations to become future victims of crimes of these leaders as they crack down on their populations and try and restrain control. But the second thing that's incredibly important is that it's always, and it should always be, the priority of the international community to negotiate cessation and a guarantee of non-repetition of crimes when they occur. And we think that this fundamentally changes the bargaining position of leaders in those situations. So it means they're going to be less likely to want to negotiate or even participate in negotiations if they fear that there'll be consequences for them in that state. And it also means that they're less likely to want to do things like travel and actually engage in the different forums and institutions that we provide them for to achieve those ends. Why do we think that's more important than the sorts of immediate justice that this side of the House is going to have to defend? Firstly, because we think that the history of the ICC is one of monumental failure that amounts to a legalistic grandstanding in international affairs. Firstly, because we rarely are able to actually mount these prosecutions themselves. Because they're in their country, we need their consent, we need the dodgy cooperation of foreign governments and trying to extract them in bad ways. But secondly, the sorts of trials that we do see occur in absentia. So they actually have no substantive effect for the population of that country beyond a vague and inconclusive symbolic effect that we do not think weighs up or stacks up against the harms that I just talked about. But thirdly, we think that they've been empirically unsuccessful in the past. But even if in the future you can prosecute one dictator, that sends an incredibly powerful message to every other person that would become subject to this policy that they are going to face the wrath. And it entrenches those norms, entrenches those incentives that I talked about at the beginning of this point. So secondly, why is sitting head of state immunity so incredibly important? We think it's one of the only universally respected norms that even really dodgy dictators are happy to respect, and it's mutually dependent on that. What does this do? Firstly, it restricts their ability to travel and represent the legitimate interests of those countries, which often do need to be talked about in international arenas. Because the same countries that have leaders that are likely to have been committing crimes that would warrant ICC prosecution are also likely to have things like sanctions placed against them. And it's important that leaders of those countries are able to talk in international arenas about the impact of those sanctions upon their country, upon their population, and represent those legitimate interests, even though they may be filthy criminals. Thirdly, we think that to the extent that that norm exists, it's important that it continues to exist because it is mutually dependent. We think that one of the things that you do when you say that head of state immunity is just not a thing, we're going to indict you now, we'll prosecute you when we can, is that you change the norm and the way in which they engage with other foreign leaders themselves. So there are incentives to do things like disrespect legal norms, about taking of hostages, and the way in which you bargain with foreign powers to improve their negotiating position should they ever have to be in a position where they face up to the ICC to avoid accountability for their actions once you make it a certainty that they will. So finally, why does this make the job of the ICC that much harder? We think there exists a perception amongst most African countries and a lot of South American countries that there is incredibly perverse targeting, that the ICC is an institution of the West that is prejudicial against them and their leaders. We endorse and lend credibility to that norm when all of a sudden you start prosecuting and indicting leaders who are the sitting heads of states of allies. That does a couple of things. Firstly, it means that it assumes that crimes occur in a vacuum. There aren't other crimes and other important crimes and other future crimes that will either be committed by those people or by future people that we need the cooperation of those states on. Firstly, it means that most countries where this would be implemented will close their doors to the ICC. They will withdraw from that institution. They'll never give its consent, and the legitimacy it universally depends on. But secondly, they'll just close their door to things like UN inspectors, so we won't know about crimes when they're occurring. We won't be able to effectively build prosecutions in the first place. And the example of that is when the ICC indicted Rose Kabuye for crimes in 1994 against the Hutus, we required the cooperation of sitting members of the Rwandan and Congolese government to be able to secure and prosecute that crime effectively. You martyr that cooperation. You martyr the legitimacy of the ICC in being able to effectively fulfill its role, and you do so for some symbolic and vague norm that prejudices and preferences an outcome that the people of those countries do not want. For that reason, we're very proud to propose.
In the case of Pol Pot, he was a leader who was afraid to step down and was afraid to lose control. Let's look at the calculus that Pol Pot would have gone under in the affirmative conception of how the world should look. The first, it's a little bit unclear what they actually wanted to do with leaders like Pol Pot, but the first option, let's say that they wanted to prosecute him after he stood down. We think that all of the incentives to not lose control, to maintain ruthless oppression of that population, exist to the extent that as soon as he stepped down or lost the control that it said, he would be prosecuted. So those types of incentives to maintain ruthless control exist under that scenario. If it was the case that they were advocating absolute and blanket immunity in today's debate, we think that that just makes the situation even worse, because there is absolutely no consequences for this behaviour in this debate. And also, the idea that they just wanted to run an immunity app, maybe Ed's introduction about saying that this was just Sydney regionals on repeat held more validity, because practice debates applied to this one, not the same. Alright, let's look at rebuttal on terms of the affirmative conception of what they thought was justice in today's debate. The first thing to point out is that Ed wanted to trash the idea that we could ever get any sort of valuable form of prosecution from the ICC. The state, if the leader cannot travel to an international forum to tell us about that, is wrong. Firstly, because we think that we can engage in that type of analysis as to the effect of sanctions without those people travelling. But secondly, we think that impounding a leader that has already committed significant war crimes, vis-a-vis the indictment for said war crimes, is actually a good idea because it acts as a punitive action upon them in being able to increase their international influence and go and justify those war crimes on an international stage. Finally, on rebuttal, we think that what it wanted to say is, if you are ever successful in prosecuting one leader, you would change the perception for everyone and freak all leaders out. That was to suggest that they were never happy to prosecute in today's debate, because if by their concession one prosecution was all we needed, then they had a problem with prosecution at a general level. Problems with that. Absolutely no consequences to proven or at least indictable war crimes of those leaders. And we think that that is a problem for the victims, because it means that they don't even receive any justice from any sort of prosecution, let alone an indictment while that leader is sitting. Moving on to my substantive, I'm going to look at two things in today's debate. The general principle of my speech is that indictment and following on prosecution serves the ends that the international community should value and prioritise in this debate for two reasons. First, on the level of serving international justice. Secondly, in assisting the fight against these leaders. So, at the level of international justice, what we support in today's debate is the ICC exercising prosecutorial discretion, even at times using things like immunity, but not adopting a blanket policy whereby they refuse to indict sitting leaders, which is the affirmative case in today's debate, I think. So, what we think is the problem with their case is that they only condemn the ICC to act after the fact. They say that the ICC can only ever act when a leader has stepped down. That is a problem for a number of reasons. Firstly, after a leader has stepped down is not the time at which most people would like to see justice extracted. We think that the victims of the crime want to have an international signifier of support and an international signifier that the international community is doing something whilst that oppression is occurring. And that is also true of the neighbours and the other countries that may be affected by the flow-on border effects of those conflicts. To just say that the ICC can only ever act after the fact severely undermines the ability of the ICC to act prospectively and undermines the respect that the international community would have for that. That is particularly because we imagine that they would still allow critical discourse within the United Nations of these abuses of human rights. So what you are saying is you want a situation where the UN will criticise and condemn and say that it's not okay for these things to exist, but say that the ICC can say absolutely nothing about it in a legal consequence of that actual criticism. We think that that means that the ICC will lose all respect and will be seen to be doing nothing in today's debate. What we think is the problem with that is that the ICC is designed to deliver justice for communities where domestic courts will not prosecute. That is precisely the situation which we are confronted with in this debate, because obviously a leader is not going to prosecute themselves in a domestic court. But also, we think that the secondary function of the ICC here is to collect and document evidence on these types of war crimes. It is important to allow that indictment process to occur while that leader is still sitting, in order that the ICC has those tasks force, has that collecting of evidence occurring at the time and not just prospectively, because we think that a leader that is going to step down is going to have destroyed a majority of the evidence before that indictment actually comes to term. Let's look now at why it assists the domestic fight against these leaders. It's for a couple of reasons. The first, and Ed conceded this, is that it limits the international movement of people like Bashir. We think it's a good thing that South Africa stopped letting him have extravagant holidays after the ICC indictment of him, because that should be taken as a punitive action against a war criminal. We don't think it's a very high burden to say that maybe we shouldn't allow war criminals to have holidays in this debate. Secondly, we think that it acts as a really important international signifier. So what we saw after Bashir was indicted is that countries like India stopped dealing with Sudanese corporations, and it made it much more awkward for China to invest in Sudan. That is good, Madam Speaker, because it stops foreign governments funding governments that are committing war crimes in today's debate. We think that that is a broad benefit, and that the ICC indictment acts as a very good signifier of a circumstance where the international community is not okay with other governments interacting and funding and investing in countries that are committing war crimes. Finally, we think it is a very effective signifier for support for opposition groups within that country. We think that there is symbolic value in us telling the oppressed in those countries that their oppression has been noted and that their resistance to that has been validated. We think that is particularly important in today's debate and provides at least some semblance of restorative justice when these guys just wanted the leaders to get off scot-free. Finally, we think that it benefits the domestic fight because it decreases, this model would decrease the incentive for a leader to step down. If the ICC endorses the idea that we will never ever prosecute you until you have stepped down, those leaders will never step down. And that is a problem in today's debate for all of the reasons that everyone just talked about. The type of oppression they are perpetrating upon their countries is the reason why they won't step down and why they will functionally keep ruling for fear of the prosecution. We think that the ICC has to be allowed to act at the time at which it is most important for it to act. That is the case when crimes are being committed, not after they have been committed. That's why we're proud to oppose.
When the government of Belgium asserted universal jurisdiction and issued an arrest warrant for Omar al-Bashir, people on the ground in South Sudan did not universally have the same reaction that the negative said they would. They were concerned, rightly, that this would inflame that conflict. They were concerned, rightly, that this would harm their ability to negotiate a solution. I'm going to deal with 3 issues of rebuttal. First, what impact does issuing an indictment have on negotiations? Second, what value does an indictment have? And thirdly, what effect does this have on the ICC itself? So firstly, what impact will allowing the ICC to indict sitting leaders have on conflicts as they exist or on the negotiating position of people who are trying to get out from under a leader? We told you a few things. The first was that it harms your ability to use immunity from prosecution, that is immunity from being prosecuted after you step down as a carrot, because it undermines the credibility of that immunity. But we told you a bit more than that. We told you that it harmed your ability to negotiate with that leader. So when we told you that we think head of state immunity is important, the ability of a leader to travel is important, it's not because we wanted these people to be able to go on long holidays. We don't particularly care for their welfare as an end in of itself. What we did care about, though, was the ability of the international community to negotiate with them and the ability of people within that country to come to negotiate solutions. When you send a message, when you send a signification that the entire international community is out to get you and that there's nothing you can do to stop that from happening, what you're doing is saying that there is no incentive to continue those negotiations. So that's why rational actors would not respond to this very well. But if we accept that not all the kinds of people who want to indict by the ICC are rational actors, if we accept that some of them will be motivated by irrational things, by spite towards the international community, which is not inconceivable, then what you're doing is sending them the message that we think that we're going to close things off from you, that there is no way out, that there is no way you can negotiate an outcome that might work. So it means that when Venezuela floats the possibility of Gaddafi taking exile in that country, that the credibility of that message is undermined because what you're telling them is that no, the international community doesn't respect that arrangement as a possible outcome for this conflict and as a possible way for you to step down. Secondly, what value does an indictment have in and of itself? We told you from the outset that merely sending a signification that the international community condemns something is nothing more than pointless grandstanding. That if you want to send a signifier that the international community sends something and encourage countries to stop trading with them, there are various other ways you could do that, like for instance having the Security Council impose sanctions on that country that actually rely on hard results and that don't involve bizarre contortions of signification. But what we told you beyond that, though, is that this symbolic value comes at a cost of being able to do all of those things. So when Belgium did issue its arrest warrant against Omar al-Bashir, the signification of that actually wasn't that the international community condemned al-Bashir any more than they had previously. What it meant was that the international community gave some sort of formalistic recognition to that condemnation that was not actually shared by most of the international community. So what's the third effect on the ICC? What we told you was that this undermines the legitimacy of the ICC because you have 2 outcomes that may happen when an indictment is issued. The first is that no trial goes ahead because the ICC does not want to pursue the case in the absence either of the perpetrator themselves or of sufficient evidence to address that. But secondly, the other option is that a trial occurs in absentia. What that means is that the trial is perceived by the international community also with the victims of the crimes that happened. But even if you're able to get a result out of this, there's nothing that you can actually enforce from until you do get access to this person, which you've already made a lot harder to do. So you make a mockery of the ICC and its process, and you do that at the cost of every other trial that the ICC may be willing and able to conduct because of its limited resources and because of the fact that the international community can't gather all the evidence that it wants. The next effect on the ICC that we told you about that has not been addressed is the fact that it provides a disincentive for any country to sign up. First, where a person is in charge of a country and fears they themselves might be indicted, it removes any incentive they have for their country to sign up. And we think that's probably unlikely to happen anyway, but in some cases they may want to do it to signify to the international community that they're on board with international law for various reasons that now no longer exist. More likely, however, there are countries where sitting dictators who are committing grave crimes might not be in power, but who nonetheless think their sovereignty is so valuable that they're not going to trade it off in this way. They're not going to allow any future head of state to be indicted in this way. So when the jurisdiction of the ICC depends on the cooperation of countries, but also when its effectiveness depends on that, doing anything to undermine that is going to result in its impotence. So what am I going to deal with in substantive? I'm going to tell you how a model where the ICC makes case-by-case distinctions as to whether or not to prosecute, and makes those decisions not on the basis of the evidence before it, not on the basis of the legal gravity of those crimes, but simply because of political judgments about the likely political consequences of that. What you do is you undermine the integrity of the ICC, and you remove its ability to function normatively as a legal regime. So what Elle told you was that they're happy for the ICC to make political judgments about what the likely consequences to negotiations or to a leader stepping down of giving them immunity while they are still sitting office are. So sometimes they'd be doing it, sometimes they wouldn't. It was never clear to us why the ICC had the capacity to make these predictions, why they were in any better position than the Security Council or any other actor in the international arena to be making those long-term consequentialist judgments. Here's why they're particularly bad at it though. They are a legal body set up to enforce legal norms. So the idea of setting up a court is that when you're able to have it exercise its power, when you've got someone in the dock, when you've got the evidence before it, it makes decisions on the basis of clear legal norms that did someone do something, is there enough evidence for this, and so on. When instead you invest that court that is set up to exercise those functions with a political function of making predictions about what the likely outcome for negotiations are, you're giving that power to an especially bad actor that does not exist when the ICC doesn't have that ability. So that's why it's badly set up to do it. But what's the effect of giving it that power? What it means is that the respect that the international community has for it is eroded. Because currently the legitimacy of the ICC, like any court, is dependent on the respect people have for its neutrality, for the fact that it makes decisions in accordance with basic legal norms and the laws of evidence, not in accordance with political judgments, like the Security Council. So when you remove that legitimacy from the ICC, what you're doing is removing an incentive for countries to sign up. You're removing the normative force of its orders, which if you wanted to function as a signifier where it can't enforce its orders, you substantially erode. Because what you're saying is that the signification of an indictment is going to be based on political factors, on whether we think this indictment will work, not on whether or not we think these crimes are especially grave. So because this is something bad for the ICC to do, and because we think it is far more important to negotiate outcomes, we're quite happy to oppose it.
Madam Chair, the affirmative team wanted to bring about successful conclusions to conflicts through negotiations, but it quickly became apparent that the main bargaining chip that they are using in these negotiations is justice. But we think that in addition to this, that it is going to achieve worse outcomes, because by creating a different standard of justice that can be expected by a leader of a country and everyone else in the international community, they create a direct incentive for people to get more violent, to hold on to those positions of power and enjoy all this preferential treatment that the affirmative team is showering on them. Let's look at two issues in rebuttal. Firstly, practical harms for the countries, and secondly, the role of the ICC. And we've heard from them that they're going to be offering immunities on a case-by-case basis in order to incentivise people to step down. We think that the result of this model will be one of two things. Either the dictators will not know that they will get immunity and therefore there will be no incentive to act on that. But if you guarantee that they get immunity, then you are guaranteeing that they will get off scot-free for their crimes, and all this whinging about Pol Pot having killed people becomes even worse because then they know that they can commit those crimes and get away with it. As I said in my introduction, they will hold on to the instruments of power longer because you have created a difference between the standard of justice you get when you're a leader and all the rights that you get in other situations. But furthermore, we just project the idea that there is no position you can negotiate on when you have indicted the leader of a country. We say it actually strengthens your negotiation position, that it is possible to rescind an ICC indictment, and that gives you powerful leverage over the country. And we would say that the fact that Sudan, despite the fact that Omar al-Bashir has been indicted, is not the belligerent actor that the first affirmative wanted to make out, that has kicked out all NGOs and all the rest of it, is direct evidence of the fact that they can be constructive in negotiations. And furthermore, we reject the red herring of the immunity in today's debate, because the fact of the matter is that you can offer them immunity whether or not you have an indictment. Your case is to justify holding off the indictment, given that that will give you all the leverage in the meantime that you are giving up. Furthermore, we think that the benefits that you've claimed of the leader getting to represent themselves on the world stage are simply not relevant or important, that they can represent the views of their people with delegates to international conferences and all the rest of it without being allowed to attract prestige and to flaunt their immunity on the world stage and justify their war crimes at international events, which is what we see people like Omar al-Bashir try and do, but something that he cannot because indictments have stopped countries like South Africa allowing him to even travel. Second issue in rebuttal about the role of the ICC. And at first speak of this material was that the ICC is seen as targeting African countries. Look, there are lots of African states that are part of the ICC and that they are pushing these prosecutions because they have the most to gain from getting rid of war criminals in their backyard. But furthermore, we think that this argument just assumes that all the African leaders were somehow war criminals and were backing each other in on this, and we didn't agree with that. At second speaker, we heard some new analysis on the role of the ICC. The danger of issuing indictments was that people wouldn't want to take part in the ICC process. Well, how completely circular? What would the value of the ICC process be if they weren't there to issue indictments against people that have committed war crimes and crimes against humanity? That participation would be made meaningless by the affirmative team's case, not by the ICC doing what is their job. The next iteration of this was our second speaker also, where he explained why the ICC was a fundamentally bad actor and not independent, and we should be trusting other sources. We think, first of all, saying that the Security Council should be doing this is rubbish, because the Security Council refers people to the ICC under the status quo, so we don't know who you think your more independent actor is in this debate. But second of all, we think that the ICC is not prejudging the outcome of negotiations of security. They are merely making a determination about whether or not there is enough evidence to prove that a leader has committed war crimes, and we think that is useful. And I'm going to be talking further in substantive. Firstly, about how this is going to privilege leaders of states to this will increase violence and disempower other people. And secondly, about why this would be the ICC abrogating its role and how that will create a void. So firstly, to why this will increase violence because it is privileging the leaders. We say that only the leaders of a state will get immunity, not the leaders of ethnic minorities in a state, not the leaders of breakaway regions in a state. None of those people will get immunity. That's a problem because war crimes are committed often on two sides of these conflicts, like we saw with the Tamils and the Sinhalese. Both could be legitimately accused of war crimes. So if they are going to say that they are being apolitical, yet they are extending immunity only to one side of the conflict, only to the side of the conflict that controls the oppressive instrumentalities of the army, we think that creates a massive problem. Firstly, it is absolutely unjust. It is unjust because it means that all war criminals on the minority side will get prosecuted and not the majority side. But secondly, we say that it also has huge practical harms because now the fight for the state becomes the fight for justice as well. If you can win government through violent means, if you can hold on to control of the army, if you can beat the other side on a field of battle or like hack all their supporters' limbs off, then you will be able to gain immunity as a result, immunity and impunity as a result of the affirmative team's model. We say that's why it's bad for justice and that's why it will increase violence. Second argument I want to bring is about how this will create a void because the ICC will not be fulfilling its role. Now the ICC currently defers to domestic courts if a country can and will prosecute a war criminal, and I was told you obviously that doesn't happen because we're talking about these countries' leaders. But at the moment the ICC does not have to make way for regional bodies like the African Union's nascent court. Now, if the ICC does not indict leaders when evidence suggests that they have committed crimes against humanity, when the international community is calling for that indictment, as with the case of Omar al-Bashir with atrocities in Darfur, we think that the ICC then loses its moral authority. It looks like a body that makes expedient political decisions rather than ones for the interests of justice. Now, this argument is very similar to Rob's argument, that rather than claiming that the Security Council should be doing this, which we know is rubbish because they refer things to the ICC, we think that the people that are most likely to fill the void will be regional courts like that of the African Union. Why is that a bad thing? We think that those aggregations of states are less independent than the ICC is, because those states, although they want action for good reasons as well, like fulfilling justice and getting rid of dictators that commit war crimes, we think that they also have prejudged the outcome or have something to gain by being the ones to commit the prosecution. We say that these African Union members are also members of the ICC, but their views are then balanced out by the majority views and are moderated by the concerns of the rest of the international community. So you know that it will be being done in an independent way because the ICC is the largest body that has the authority given to it by the UN and with the most number of members to know that it will have an independent result rather than a fix by the African Union's new court. Ladies and gentlemen, we think this model will just encourage more violence to hold on to that useful immunity that the affirmative is giving them. We don't see how it's going to harm the indictments, harm negotiations. Rather, they're an extra bargaining chip. We beg to oppose.
Paul asked, what else is the ICC doesn't prosecute war crimes, crimes against humanity in all instances? The case of the affirmative was never that A, justice could ever do that, ladies and gentlemen, or B, that was its aim. What we said was that what this proposal did was deprioritise heads of state, ladies and gentlemen, in a way that increased and maintained ICC power and the relationships with states that were necessary for all the kinds of prosecution that the ICC needed to do. Not just heads of state, but we go after this debate, ladies and gentlemen, cooperation from those states was important throughout this debate. With that said, I'm going to ask 3 questions in this speech. The first, what quality of justice do we get from attempting to indict sitting leaders? Secondly, how best do we improve the situation on the ground in instances where these regimes remain in power? And thirdly, what is the broader implications for the role of the ICC as a body of international justice of this proposal? So firstly, what quality of justice do we get from indicting sitting leaders in this debate? Elle told us at first that it was important that we timed our prosecutions so that they occurred within the time that those regimes were in power, because those were where the crimes were felt by those people. We said first that there were disadvantages to that because it changes the situation on the ground. Those people don't actually perceive that prosecutions are even occurring. What they perceive is what happens in their immediate environment and the way in which those crackdowns occur are likely to occur, ladies and gentlemen. So it increases the paranoia as soon as that warrant is placed out. They never showed us what translates from the warrant being issued in the first instance to the improvement on Sudan on the ground. So Sudan was a belligerent. We question that from the perspective of the people in the Darfur region. Question whether that regime became less violent as a result of the issuing of that violence. The second conception that Bell made was this beneficial to victims and beneficial to victims because they got that from one instance. We'd say first and foremost that there are instances in which we could have better benefits to victims if that prosecution was to occur in the first instance. So this seems to be operating under the assumption that the only way in which regimes will potentially change is if these ICC prosecutions are successful. There are obviously other natural forces at play, other other interventions that are at play, other instances in which those regimes may fall, and that interventions will occur at a later date. So the choices in this debate is sometimes we'll use immunity to get those people to step down. Sometimes they will continue to be empowered in a way that we think is worse, and in other occasions that regime will fall naturally and the prosecutions will occur at a later date. There are advantages to that timing being at a later date, because it helps the new regime that exists in that country to validate a narrative of their legitimacy source of that power, rather than giving the people who still control that state a narrative of paranoia against the West trying to persecute that state while they have legitimate heirs that's right. The second thing, Al told us on this issue, was better because the ICC had a purpose in gathering evidence and that evidence was important. The first thing we say about it is that there's a problem, where there's a problem with destroying evidence, there's an incentive that exists under either proposal when both sides assume that those regimes were in place to begin with. But more importantly, if we are only focusing on as a negative is continuously done in this debate on those prosecutions of leaders, it forfeits or masters the ways in which we could use the cooperation of that state to gain evidence against other war crimes victims of that institution. So we told you in aspects at the outset of this debate that although there are people within the regime of the Democratic Republic of Congo whose cooperation we may not want because they may have war criminals themselves, that cooperation was helpful for the prosecution of people lower down regimes in Rwanda in 1994. And we forfeit that cooperation when you say that there's a requirement of being a government of that state we can indict you at any point in time. It's preferable to help send the message that we won't indict them at that particular point in time. The final thing that Al told us on this issue was that the message that the affirmative case sent in the instances where A, we offered immunities, and B, we said that one prosecution would endanger the action of the future legal. Endanger the action of the future in those states would be that we were sending a message that we didn't want to prosecute at all. No. To the extent that the negative proposal in today's debate was ever effective, it would raise the fact that those prosecutions may occur at a later date. They never showed us why issuing that warrant against Bashir has ever helped the situation on the ground of Sudan, ladies and gentlemen. We are able to prioritise instances in which that regime falls in another way. But what we were able to say is in the instance that prosecution is unlikely, we can put other options on the table. Which leads me nicely to the second question in this debate. Is what best improves the situation on the ground? The first reason to say is to consider is that there is an opportunity cost going after the leaders that is what Rob told you about. The states were less likely to sign up in the first instance, we were less likely to get people off the battlefield that were continuing to commit those instances of war crimes and crimes against humanity, even if they weren't the leaders of those states. What else did we hear on this issue? We had kind of like a pop psychology discussion about what the likely incentives were under what scenario these leaders would want to live. What we told you was that under the status quo, where there's an indictment out against them, main motivating factor of that leader is that in the instance that their regime falls, or in the instance that they leave that country, that indictment goes against them. Under our proposal, they have a third option, ladies and gentlemen. That third option means they have the means by which to avoid cracking down on their people in all the ways that they told you about at the outset of this debate, by denying access, by improving the ability of their military to crack down on those people, and that was likely to occur. Paul and Elle repeated the analysis that under our proposal, they never have any incentive to step down. First response they gave earlier in respect. There are other means by which those regimes could fall, that regime change could come about. But second, that incentive was driven by the fact that potential immunity could occur. That's why we privilege the justice of improving the situation on the ground is more relevant to those people, ladies and gentlemen, than potentially putting that person on the stand, prosecuting them at a later date, or in the instances which we don't think that would ever occur. The final area of consultation under this issue, two more actually, was about the nature of negotiations and then Paul's point about increased violence. On negotiations, Paul told us that negotiations were still possible under this proposal because we had the opportunity to rescind that indictment in the event that that individual came to the table and began to negotiate with us about the future of that state. We think that conceded if that was an option on the table, that the ICC should use its political leverage in circumstances where it would privilege changes in those states rather than privilege the instances where they want to prosecute that person. If they were ever going to rescind those indictments, that was something they conceded. Second, Paul pointed to Sudan as a success case of indictments where states hadn't been privileged. I've already questioned that in this speech. In Paul's substantive material, he told us that this was likely to increase violence because it was necessarily political, that we were focused on one side of the conflict and not the other. So let's deal with that material now. First and foremost, this is a policy that doesn't excuse everyone in that country, but excuses the head of the state in the instance that they take that immunity. That's particularly specific in this study in general. We need the information that Rob told you about and that Ed told you about those prosecutions to occur in the first instance. The second effect that Paul suggested was that kind of the additional marginal motivation that immunity could potentially offer in the future, that you won that war, took that regime, committed war crimes, and then down the decade could receive immunity, was such a marginal effect to the extent of the violence of that war that we weren't really willing to have in this debate. There were other reasons why people would want to win that war, for instance, why they were there in the first place. Third and final issue in this debate. What is the role of the ICC and how has it changed by this debate? We heard objections, ladies and gentlemen, from the outset, and this was the substance of Paul's material at second, that this would forfeit the control out the ICC at the moment to more regional courts and more regional bodies, nascent bodies like the African Union courts. We thought that was unlikely for exactly this kind of reason that the prosecutions were unlikely under the status quo. There were significant barriers to getting the leaders out of their country in the first place when they had a powerful incentive to hold on to that power. So it's never been plausibly explained in this matter why those leaders would want to leave. We don't think those cases were ever going to be heard for the African Union in particular. What did we tell you in this issue? The first thing we told you was that the ICC should be a political body insofar as it values its own legitimacy into the future. So it continues to produce and attempt to prosecute impotent cases, that doesn't help its reputation, ladies and gentlemen. And in fact, when it obliges states or continues to oblige states to forfeit its leaders or attempt to forfeit its leaders, that makes those states less likely to enter the ICC in the first place. That's a particular problem where there are exceptions to Latin America and Africa that the ICC targets their countries, and where people are invested in those leaders, even if they're not from the oppressed class, ladies and gentlemen, but they're less likely to be invested in that institution to begin with. Because we've shown you that substantive justice is more likely under our proposal, because we've shown you that the situation on the ground is likely to be improved by this proposal, because we've shown you that this proposal best connects with the role of the ICC, we're very proud of this proposal.
Madam Speaker, the first speaker on the affirmative in this debate was happy with continual criticism and pressure being placed on these leaders. The second speaker on the affirmative was happy with us to sanction these leaders and prevent trade and investments. By the time we got to the third speaker of the affirmative, they said we won't indict the leaders, but we're happy with indictments on other people serving that government or serving under them. What aim do they seek by pursuing these policies? Well, they didn't want to make the government paranoid. They didn't want to give them the feeling that other nations hated them. And they didn't want to make it seem likely to that government that when they step down, they'd be prosecuted for war crimes. We think, guys, that when you sanction them, criticise them, and try and prosecute their deputies, they'll get the memo. We don't think that we think these continual step downs by the opposition proved why selecting a leader arbitrarily and being able to prosecute other people didn't make a big difference. I have three questions. Number one, which team affects the behaviour of the leader better? Number two, who best assists those fighting against tyranny? And number three, who best assists the ICC? To this first question about the behaviour of these leaders. Now, the case we heard at Ed is what they were seeking is to change the fact that it was very likely you'd be prosecuted for your war crime to just being kind of likely it was being prosecuted for your war crime, in the hope that would change the incentives of leaders engaging in this debate. What we said is the only example of a leader that they thought who acts free of the incentives of the ICC was Pol Pot, someone who committed atrocities before the creation of the ICC, which we think shows you there's something innate to being a leader of a despotic regime who commits war crimes, and that you become aware of that fact, and become aware that it's distasteful, and that there are likely to be future consequences. And just giving someone an indictment, which Paul pointed out can be rescinded later on, only changes that likelihood marginally. It doesn't necessarily create the behaviour that make those people crazy. What would make those people crazy and change their behaviour is saying that the moment that you stop being leader is the moment that we will start prosecuting you, as consistent with what Dom just said at the most recent speaker. That's what would send these people into the kind of situations where they wanted to ensure they maintain control of that country. Dom's response to this was, oh yes, but there are other options to get them to negotiate later, or to bring down that leader in the long term. Well, there are also other options on our side. Like, if it was true that only offering this made it more difficult, those other options could even be on our side to replace that leader. Where this debate was rich and interesting was where specifically that option wasn't on the table. And we said, in fact, that fear of the ICC prosecution would bring them to a negotiation. And we gave the example at Paul's speech that Dom ignored of the way that in Sudan, they allowed the South of Sudan to secede, which was the biggest compromise achieved in that conflict thus far, after the point of a ICC indictment, which proves that doesn't necessarily mean they never cooperate afterwards. Instead, what they wanted was to allow this leader to continue to represent themselves at the head of that government and international agreements. We were never proud to stand by that in this debate, Madam Speaker. We said that that only meant that these individuals could control the narrative internationally, and we felt that the emissaries or, phones would be good ways of conducting those discussions or conducting them within the country itself. We never thought we had to recognise those people as leaders. How do we change the interest of the people in the state? Because Ed spent about half of his speech comparing prospective justice and retrospective justice, ignoring the fact that Elle was going to spend half of her speech talking about how we thought we did something for prospective justice as well, and that wasn't a choice that we had to make in this debate. What they said is all the kind of things that you wanted to talk about in this debate could be achieved through UN criticism and sanctions. Well, we thought there were some fundamental differences. So, for instance, when the leader of a state who's despotic says, I'm engaged in a civil war, I'm no more of a war criminal than the other side, the problem is that rhetoric seems true if we're criticising them in this conflict, but unwilling to mount a legal case against them. And in fact, confuses that conflict, especially since they've had no problem indicting rebel leaders, and that wasn't something they were arguing for in the debate, which only perverted that narrative within that country. But the next thing we said is limiting their rights and movements, not allowing themselves to present themselves as the head of state, was a fundamentally more powerful way of doing this. The next thing that we said was that, well, Ed portrayed this in a sentence as we wouldn't want dodgy other states to dodgily intervene or remove this leader. Why would these states necessarily be dodgy or do it in a dodgy way? In fact, if you want to limit the dodginess, show them a legitimate path and a legitimate time to remove a leader. And that legitimacy comes from an ICC indictment because it says that members of the ICC can then act to arrest that leader. And we thought that was a good way of stopping this tyranny. Maybe that was the kind of other options that Dom alluded to that wouldn't exist under their system. What we said that they then said in response was that prosecution later on, when this group is in government, a lot of questions they can then eventually end up in government, but when this group was in government, that's when it would have the most value. Well, we'd say that you can still claim the value of that prosecution, and being the successor government to someone who's been recognised internationally as a war criminal while they were in office, and prosecuted while they were in office, is incredibly valuable. But furthermore, it was right as Dom said, that sometimes we recognise that prosecutorial discretion occurs at all levels of justice, including the international level, where we recognise that the international court is not connected to an international police force. What we said is it was unclear why they would never use the ICC's discretion as it stood to actually, or incredibly rarely, prosecute leaders when those leaders are the ones at the heart and the head of this movement, those ones that the groups inside that country identify with. The next thing they said was those groups will never find out. Well, then they'll never find out about your sanctions or your UN criticism either. We thought they would find out because these are the people connected to the international community and what responses they're having there. And these are the rebels that require the most validation when they find out. So one of those groups was incredibly important. Let's go on to the defence of the ICC. Now, I didn't really think this was going to be one of my questions at the beginning of this debate, because if you listen to Ed, it wasn't clear the Ed cared about the ICC very much at all. It was a toothless tiger, never got any work done. But by the time they got to third, the ICC was back in the debate as something important to have in post-conflict states and something important to have for other people. What they then attempted to do was to say that we should hamstring the ICC against the biggest culprits and the orchestrators of war crimes in order for it to maintain legitimacy in the international community. That was absurd. Because if they were worried about bias, it was unclear why they would intervene on one side of the conflict, the most disempowered, but not the ones running that government, and then give incentive to those disempowered people to escalate the conflict and their war crimes in order to get power so they would avoid immunity. We thought that was an absurd thing for the ICC to preside over. We then thought as well that future convictions would still be possible. So the example of Rwanda falls on our side, because the government that cooperated with convictions in 1994 was the post-genocidal government that stood for and supported and indeed funded convictions of those individuals. And the evidence was likely to exist, because as Elle explained, if you're indicting these people already, you already have significant evidence. And to be honest, we said that the war crimes don't necessarily stay contained entirely within one border. And that members of the ICC should recognise that refugee flows into their countries, that war crimes committed in their countries impact on them too. And when they signed the Rome Statute, they didn't sign it so that the worst perpetrators of violence and crimes against humanity could get away with it. They signed it so that would be enforced against them and against their interests and their citizens, and also against other citizens. So we think we're likely to incentivise more member states to join that organisation by giving it discretion to indict against leaders. We also thought as well that their example in Africa was they didn't think it was likely that regional courts would come into play. But we said that when they did come into play, they were likely to be corrupt because some of the reasons that Ed talked about neighbouring states intervening, and therefore the ICC was the best body and should get them now. Madam Speaker, we thought that if anyone in this debate was encouraging people to hand over power responsibly, was giving the West a bargaining chip against despotic leaders and tyrants, was supporting materially beyond the criticism and recognising the cause of those oppressed, it was our side, and that is why we are so proud to oppose.
Madam Chair, war crimes are awful, but that doesn't mean that the international community lay all of its cards down on the table too early for war criminals to see, and give them a certain fear of imminent prosecution that will only mean they tighten their grip on power and hold their countries hostage. I'll ask two questions. Firstly, what's better for international justice? And secondly, what's better for the ICC? Firstly, the negative team in this debate hung their hat on a form of justice that was largely symbolic, largely toothless, and that people in these countries did not want. What we told you they did want was change, was an end to conflict and a guarantee that their leader would be removed and restrained from a position of power that would enable them to commit future crimes. We think that this was a policy under the status quo that gave those leaders a certainty that they would be prosecuted as soon as they lost power, and if they lost control and handed it over. We think that that gave them good reason to be repressive and good reason to be restrictive. What were the three areas of clash under this? Firstly, this banter about immunity. We said that we'd use immunities in a targeted and discretionary way to get them to step down when we needed them to. That was a tool that both teams were willing to say was legitimate, but we were going to use it to overcome the analysis of entrenching these regimes. We were also going to use it to say that we could decrease the fear of those leaders of imminent prosecution while applying other soft mechanisms, like sanctions and like prosecuting other crimes within those borders, without giving the people in the biggest position of power to be able to actually do that. But thirdly, the fact that it was targeted meant that the analysis of this team as to like the political use of it meant that it was just not realistic in the way that the ICC would use it in circumstances when it would be inflammatory. What are the justifications that we've heard from this team as to why indictments were important? They gave us three. Firstly, it was important to stop al-Bashir from taking holidays in South Africa. We said that punitive action also endangered the ability of those leaders to be the representative of the legitimate interests of their country and the best actor to represent those concerns. But secondly, they told us that it was important to stop investment and influence behaviour, despite the fact that we told you there were other mechanisms to achieve that same thing without fiddling with like legal justice, and that secondly, they conceded within that point that China doesn't care anyway. Thirdly, they said that it was symbolically important to let people know that we recognise their oppression and know that they're being oppressed now. We said that that perception of supporting the interests of those people was not as important as actually supporting the interests of those people by creating a better negotiating position and leveraging incentives that meant that those people were more likely to engage in change and engage in negotiations. But thirdly, we told you that just because you can't indict them while they're sitting did not mean that you could not ever indict them. And Don gave you the analysis that in the vast majority of circumstances, regime happens without the involvement of the ICC. And our model allows cooperation and involvement in prosecuting them and letting a narrative to the next regime to follow. So second, what's better for the ICC? We told you that this politicises what should be an independent legal institution. It entrenched existing suspicions that it was an instrument of the West, which meant that countries wouldn't sign up, that they would close their door to inspectors, and that they would end cooperation that would firstly decrease the information that would allow us to build prosecutions about other crimes and future crimes, but secondly, would decrease the normative legitimacy of those prosecutions when they did occur. What did these guys tell us? They said that it was tantamount to picking sides. We said that is true of like any prosecution, any immunity ever, and that as a result it's never entirely possible to be completely apolitical, and that shouldn't be the basis on which the ICC makes decisions. It should be more realistically and consequentially defined. But secondly, they told us that it undermines the moral authority of the ICC, which flew in the face of the context that I brought you in first, where they are already pretty unsuccessful, pretty toothless, and don't have a large amount of moral authority. And Dom's analysis was nuanced, not a contradiction, in saying that they would be better resourced and able to target and selectively engage in the prosecutions under our policy of what they would want to do. But finally, we think that the moral authority of the ICC should be based on the outcomes that it achieves, not the grandstanding impositions that it takes. And for those reasons, this motion must stand.
Stephen. Yeah. Oh God, why not? Move through.
The case of the affirmative in today's debate was to criticise indictments on the basis that they would make despotic leaders paranoid that we were targeting them. Their solution was to target those leaders in other ways, which we thought was not only counterintuitive in this debate, but also at times very confusing. The first question that needs to be asked in this reply was, what does an indictment mean for the domestic fight against a criminal regime? What we told you from the very outset of this debate is that there were several values that an indictment in and of itself imparted to that situation. The first was that it limited international movement, which meant that these people would stop justifying their crimes and increasing their influence on an international stage. That was a harm of the type of trips that they wanted to advocate were a good idea that was never responded to. Secondly, we told you that it would stop states from other foreign states from cooperating and funding criminal regimes, and that indictments served as an important international signifier in this regard. The response to this that we heard from the affirmative team is that we could achieve that through sanctions and we could achieve that through other mechanisms. That response to our challenges, Madam Speaker, undermined their stance in today's debate, that what they really wanted was to be able to negotiate with these regimes, to get access to these regimes, and to get cooperation from their regimes. Because it was unclear why sanctions and why criticism and while the international outrage that they all conceded existed was any less coercive than the type of indictment that we proved would be valuable. The second issue then was to analyse at the end of this debate what the calculus of these leaders were. The affirmative team wanted to tell you that if we indicted them, there would be a crackdown to which they would become more oppressive. We proved to you that this indictment was probably no more coercive than the affirmative suggestions. But moreover, we told you that it wasn't always the case that indictment led to us being unable to negotiate with these regimes. Indeed, we told you in my speech that the pressure may lead us to more concessions from those leaders. And both Paul and Swain analysed the example of Sudan as being a case where indictment did not, in fact, lead to less progress. So what happened in this debate if we didn't indict serving leaders? We told you there were two scenarios. The first is that those leaders would hold on to power and increase their oppression so that they could avoid the prosecution that was imminent when they were no longer sitting leaders. The second possibility was that they would just do really bad things to either get into power or to bully the international community into giving them immunity. Both of those things we thought were more harmful than indicting those people for the criminals that they actually were. At the end of this issue, we think that what we proved is that the ICC had value. And indeed, the affirmative team in today's debate wanted to assert that the ICC had value. Because by Dom's speech, we heard that the ICC would be prosecuting all of these people. I told you at the very beginning of this debate that it was a problem to disallow the ICC to act at the most important time of criminal action, which was when it was occurring. That was a harm to the ICC that they never wanted to deal with. But their final issue on the ICC as a body was that it was too political, and this was Rob's substantive material. He told us that the ICC should not prejudge negotiations and that they would be better weighed up by the Security Council. We told you in response to that the Security Council is the body that refers claims to the ICC. And secondly, that the value of the legal judgment, not necessarily the political judgment of the ICC, was important as a signifier of our outrage. Finally, Paul told you that if they wanted to be apolitical, they failed because they privileged non-in-power ethnic groups in this debate. So finally, at the end of this, we told you that we had the options the affirmative team had, but we had the additional and valuable one of indicting those leaders. We thought that was important, and we thought their concessions proved that they thought this was important as well. That's why the negative